Hi, everyone. For those of you who've joined us already, we'll be starting in just about a minute. So stay tuned. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get going. Welcome, everyone. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm the director at UC Center Sacramento, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to what happens to be the inaugural session of our fall quarter 2020-2021 speaker series. This particular event is special for at least three reasons. First, of course, as I mentioned, it's the first session of the new quarter, and we're always excited to get a new series going. Second, we're joined here for the first time by our fall UC Center Sacramento undergraduates, all of whom will be taking distance learning courses and participating in remote internships through UCCS around the Capitol, although they'll be doing that remotely. And third, this special session with Dr. Christine Madsen is co-sponsored by the UC Berkeley Food Institute and the California Initiative for Health Equity in Action. So we thank them for joining us in bringing Dr. Madsen to you. So a word about our speaker. Christine Madsen is Associate Professor at UC Berkeley's School of Public Health and Faculty Director for the Berkeley Food Institute. She's a pediatrician with expertise in pediatric obesity, cardiovascular risk, and health disparities, and she's partnered with schools, health departments, and cities to expand the reach of school and community programs that promote health. Dr. Madsen received her bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and a combined MPH and MD degree from Indiana University. Dr. Madsen's research recently has focused on in-depth evaluation of soda taxes in the Bay Area, and she's published several high-profile articles already concerning the results of that evaluation. But when we brought her here for the speaker series, we asked her if she could perhaps combine her work on soda taxes with some of the more timely and topical issues that have arisen for us as a state and a nation through the spring and summer, namely, of course, the COVID pandemic and issues of racial equity. We realized that was asking a lot, but judging from the title that we can all see on the slide, it seems like Dr. Madsen's ready to give it a go. So we applaud you for that and welcome you here to UCCS. Dr. Christine Madsen.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz. And I recognize that there's a lot going on in the world right now. I appreciate people showing up. And I do think that it's important to think about why soda taxes could actually address pandemics and create greater racial equity. So what we'll cover today, I'm going to talk about why jurisdictions are taxing sugar-sweetened beverages, evidence on the impact of SSB taxes. By the way, I'm going to use SSB and sugar-sweetened beverage and probably sugary drinks interchangeably. How SSB tax revenues are being invested, and finally, how SSB tax investments can increase health equity and create resiliency in the face of disasters like this pandemic. So first, why tax SSBs? And more precisely, why tax distributors of SSBs? I'm going to get into that in a couple of slides, but I just want you to bookmark that we're actually taxing distributors. So as Dr. Kravitz mentioned, I'm a pediatrician. I spent a lot of time working with families trying to mitigate cardiovascular risk, and heart disease is the #1 killer, not just in the United States now, but globally as well. We know that added sugars in our diets are a leading cause of premature death from heart disease. So those with the highest sugar intake have about twice the risk of dying early from cardiovascular disease, as do those with the lowest intake. sugar sweetened beverages are the #1 source of added sugars in the US diet. And while there is some good news, some of you may actually have seen the study that came out this week documenting a reduction in heavy consumption of sugar sweetened beverages. And we've known for a while, this is actually recent industry data on soda consumption, that at least soft drinks have been declining. The problem is that this has to be set in the context of the complete story on soda consumption, and our data actually go all the way back to the 1950s when people were drinking far less. So back in 1950, the average person was drinking about 10 gallons per person per year, which is arguably still a lot, but this peaked at 50 gallons per person per year around 2000. And it has declined, but we're still at about 40 gallons per person per year. And we know that this is linked to diabetes. You can see the graph over time as people were consuming more, the prevalence of diabetes increased, going from about 1% of the population to almost 8% of our population over the period of time that soda consumption was increasing, with an appropriate time lag because the metabolic effects of changing our diet take some time to manifest. And we know that just 1 serving per day of SSBs increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes by 26%. And this comes from a review of multiple studies following people for thousands of years combined. So knowing this, and I think there is a general sense that sugar sweetened beverages are not great for our health, how is it that we're consuming so much? And I think it's pretty obvious that Coke and Pepsi alone spend $10 billion a year advertising. And the sort of rule of thumb is that we are all exposed to about 1,000 ads a day of some kind or another with people trying to get us to buy their products. So when you weigh the amount of money that the beverage industry can put into advertising its products against what we in public health can actually put out as information, that's actually what's called in economics imperfect information. And so to make truly informed choices, you have to have a fair and balanced conveyance of the risks and benefits, which we don't right now. So the healthcare cost of diabetes are enormous. In the US, we spend $327 billion every year on diabetes alone. If we were leading our community, what kinds of solutions would we look for then? So what can leaders do when they have tremendous concerns about what's going on? Well, for one, they can figure out how to compel industry to set prices that reflect the health hazards of its products. And additionally, they can ensure that industry bears some of the costs associated with consumption of their products so that they essentially pay their fair share. And this is why worldwide, over 40 countries have now enacted sugar sweetened beverage taxes. The United States has taxes currently in 7 cities. Back in 2014, the Diné Nation or Navajo Nation did also enact a tax that's not just on soft drinks, it's also on junk foods. That was just a 2% sales tax. And Berkeley was the first city in California to enact its tax. It passed on the ballot back in 2014. It's 1 cent per ounce, as are the other 3 taxes in the Bay Area. Philadelphia was next. It passed a tax of 1.5 cents per ounce. Boulder, Colorado has a tax of 2 cents per ounce, and Seattle has 1 3/4 cents per ounce tax. I'll note that Cook County no longer has a tax, that it was only in effect for 3 months. It was a slightly different type of tax. It was a sales tax, not a distributor tax. It was also 1 cent per ounce. I'm going to include them just because I'll include them in a couple of slides since studies were done of the effect of those taxes, or of that tax. So let's start so we're all on the same page about how SSB excise taxes work. And I apologize, we have some people I'm sure in this crowd who know policy far better than I and tax policy far better than I. But just so we all are thinking about this the same way, let's note that the 7 taxes we have across the cities in California are all distributor taxes. That means the tax is paid directly by distributors, not by people, and it goes directly to cities. The distributor pays that tax, so it costs them more to do some business since they're paying for some of the health harms of their products. That means that they're going to raise the price for retailers. Retailers are expected then to raise the price for consumers, so the shelf price goes up. Consumers see this increased shelf price, and then this affects their behavior so that they buy fewer SSBs, and this leads to consuming fewer SSBs. Meanwhile, the city is able to invest those revenues in community. And the combination of investing revenues in community combined with lower consumption of sugar sweetened beverages does promote greater health equity. And I'm going to talk about that specifically. So what do we know then about this mechanism, all of these steps of a tax? First, in terms of evidence on the impact of SSBs, distributors do pay cities the tax. So as of last year, when you look across all 7 cities with taxes, the average annual revenue combined is $134 million. And the amount that the cities receive in sugar sweetened beverage taxes varies from almost 80 million in Philadelphia to less than $1 million in Albany, California. And this is based not just on the size of the tax, but also population. Philly's a much larger city, obviously, than Albany, California. Next, let's talk about how SSB prices increase after taxes. So just to orient you to the graph, I'm going to show you from studies across all of the cities shown across the bottom here, how the price of their soft drinks, sugar sweetened beverages, has increased. And I'm going to do it in cents per ounce because that's the scale of the tax. So remember that in our California cities with the tax, it's all 1 cent per ounce. In Boulder, Seattle, and Philly, the taxes are a little bit higher. So studies in California have found significant increases in price across Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco, and all of them reflect almost exactly the amount of the tax, so the amount the distributors are paying to the city. This means that on average, a 12-ounce can of Coke the price would increase by 12 cents. A 20-ounce bottle of sports drinks, the price would increase by 20 cents. Now in Boulder, Seattle, and Philly, we also saw significant price increases. However, only Philly fully passed through the value of the distributor tax to prices. It may be that in Boulder and Seattle, the effect of the tax was retailers were reluctant to pass the entire tax on. It may be that distributors didn't pass the tax on fully to retailers. But what this means is that the city is still receiving 2 cents for every ounce of sugar sweetened beverages sold because the distributor pays them that, but shelf price only increased by 1 cent per ounce. I'll note that these changes are relative to untaxed cities. So this isn't just the effect of inflation. This isn't just change in prices over time. This is compared to how prices were changing in cities without a tax. And I'll also note that there is significant variability by product in store. So while I'm giving you the average increase in price, some stores don't increase as much as others. For example, a large chain drugstore may not increase its prices in a single city the way that, say, a local grocery store would. So the next step in that chain is if prices go up and consumers are seeing a higher shelf price, do they buy less? And we do know sugary drink sales decline 1 year post-tax. So again, in multiple studies that have been done, and I'll just orient you over here to the graph, this is reduction in volume sales. So what this means is that in Berkeley, for example, the total ounces of sugar sweetened beverage sold declined by 10% in 1 year after the tax, and declined by 50% in Philadelphia. A couple of notes, in Berkeley, these data are based on only 3 sort of high-end grocery stores. All the data from the other cities is actually based on large retail scanner data sets. So that means your major supermarket chains, drugstore chains, even convenience store chains and box stores all contribute data. And in these other cities, that's where those data come from, showing these significant declines. I'll also note that for Oakland and San Francisco, our team is still working on these studies. And so these are preliminary results. They've not yet been subject to peer review, but these are the results we expect we'll be publishing. One of the things to note is that consumers, the health impact of taxes may not be as great if consumers leave their city and go to a city that doesn't have a tax. So one of the downfalls of small geographies for taxes, like a city tax, is that it's pretty easy for somebody to just walk next door and go to an untaxed location. And we did see cross-border purchasing in Berkeley, Philly, and Chicago. And so for Philadelphia, the net reduction was actually 37% in sales if you take into account that people were actually buying more just across the border, in like the 2-mile border just across from just outside of Philadelphia. And the same in Chicago. It went from about 27% gross reduction to a net reduction of 21%. Now, Seattle, there was no significant cross-border shopping, and we don't see it in the Bay Area cities either. And we think this is because of geography. So for Philadelphia and Chicago, while they have water on one side of their border, the other 3 sides are all metropolitan area where people can easily go and shop. Oakland, San Francisco, and Seattle all have unique geographies so that it's harder for them to actually go right next to a city next door. Oakland, for example, is bounded by water on the west, open space, no metropolitan area on the east, Berkeley on the north, which already had a tax, so that their only place to go would be south. And for San Francisco and Seattle, they're largely surrounded by water with either bridges or just major freeways getting them out of the cities. We also have seen that SSB consumption declines in low-income neighborhoods. So over the first 3 years of Berkeley's tax, among people in low-income neighborhoods, we saw a total reduction in sugar-sweetened beverages of 52%. The largest and significant reductions were seen for the particular items: regular soda, sports drinks, and sweetened coffee and tea. Sweetened fruit drinks blanking on that. Oh, energy drinks, sweetened fruit drinks and energy drinks saw smaller and non-significant declines. But what was some really good news that we saw was that consumption of water increased. And this isn't just purchased bottled water necessarily. This is just drinking water, even tap water. And this is exactly what we want from a public health perspective to see people move towards. This is the best substitution. Given those declines, we absolutely expect to see positive health outcomes as a result of SSB taxes. It's early still, just like it took, you may remember from the graph that I showed, the increase in consumption over time of sugar-sweetened beverages. There was a lag before we saw an increase in diabetes. Similarly, as people change their habits and consume less, I expect a lag before we see the metabolic impacts of these changes. But models have looked at what a California statewide sugar-sweetened beverage tax of 1 cent per ounce would do in terms of 10-year reductions in new cases of diabetes. And what they find is that overall, the overall population, we would expect a reduction of 3% in new cases of diabetes. We'd see triple that among African Americans and twice that in the Latinx community, with a 7% decline expected in low-income communities. This is particularly important since the burden of disease lies largely in communities of color and low-income communities based on years of structural racism that have changed how things show up in low-income communities, who has access to foods, advertising, as we talked about before. And the model, also looking at this California statewide tax, projects 10-year healthcare savings in diabetes costs only of over $600 million. And if you include heart disease as well, a $1 billion savings over 10 years in healthcare costs. Now, notably, this is not the revenue from the taxes. This is just the expected health increases due to the reduction in SSB consumption. So the summary of the evidence then on what we know about SSB taxes: 1, there's a net reduction in SSB sales across all the largest cities of at least 20%. 2, we have projected reductions of 23,000 new diabetes cases in California over 10 years. And projected healthcare savings of over $1 billion in California over 10 years with a statewide tax. So let's talk about how those SSB taxes are being invested. So to do this, I and some colleagues just spent the last year reviewing public documents from all 7 cities that have taxes now. We essentially pulled budgets for the fiscal year, the 2019-20 or 2021 fiscal year, to see how cities were allocating sugar-sweetened beverage tax revenues and what they were choosing to fund, who they were choosing to fund, and what the goals of those revenue allocations were. I'll also note that we looked at the language of their ordinances and what proponents of the taxes had said about how those taxes would be spent, to see whether or not the actual allocations aligned with what they had said they would do. Overall, in that single fiscal year that we studied for each city, there were a total of 190 allocations that we saw, so distinct allocations made, totaling 137 million. So you may remember I showed a table at the beginning looking at the annual tax revenues across cities. You may remember that Philly had an annual revenues of 78 million, 77.7 million, and Albany had less than $1 million. So this is what, basically these are what cities had seen so far on average coming in each year. So this is what they probably thought they would have to spend in a year. We then looked at what the budgets said they were going to do with that money, how they were going to allocate it in the most recent fiscal year. So these orange bars compare or show you how much of the revenues the cities actually allocated. So for example, in Albany and Berkeley, it's really close. In Oakland, you'll notice this big difference. So 10 million is about what they expect to take in a year in the taxes. And here they're spending 18 million. This is because in the prior fiscal year, they had carry forward. They had not spent that much of their taxes. It took them a while to sort of get things together. And so they were making up for it. In San Francisco and Seattle, there's a little bit of a gap. This is not, we don't believe this is tax evaluation or administration because we actually counted those. This probably stayed in the general fund. And Boulder and Philly are almost identical, so that cities really are spending almost all of what they're bringing in. In coding all of the allocations, we organized them into 3 major categories. Most of the allocations, so 66% of the money, actually went to developing human and community capital, and then 27% went towards health promotion. Only 7% was used for tax administration and evaluation. So let's take a deeper dive and look at the human and community capital investments. So of the 90 million invested in human and community capital, most of it, 58 million, went to early childhood support. This was done largely in Philadelphia and in Seattle. Philly actually has committed to providing quality early childhood education to all children in the city, regardless of family's ability to pay. And this is really important because we know that exposure to early childhood education leads to higher rates of high school completion, more likelihood of enrolling in 4-year college, and better chance at full employment. On the improving infrastructure measure here, where 21 million were dedicated to improving infrastructure, almost all of this went to parks and rec facilities, with additionally some libraries in Philadelphia that was trying to revamp its public spaces. But investing in parks and rec, particularly in swimming pools, and Oakland had to shut a number of its swimming pools prior to getting the revenues from the taxes. This is critical because, first of all, youth need to learn to swim. Drowning is actually the most common cause of death for young children up through age 11 or 12. And Black children, African-American children, youth are 6 to 10 times more likely to drown than white children. So having access to public pools where everyone can learn to swim is critical for equity. In terms of economic and human development, 7 million were invested. Most of this went to job training and professional development. This particular picture here is from Farming Hope in San Francisco, and they do job training for formerly incarcerated and homeless. And then lastly, 4 million went towards youth development, encouraging youth and promoting their readiness for both careers and for college, also critical in making sure that youth can participate fully in society. Let's turn then to the other major allocation around health promotion. So pulling that apart, we see that of the total 37 million invested in health, the largest allocation went 17 million directly to supporting access to healthy foods and beverages. So this was largely in the form of either double your bucks with SNAP or vouchers for veggies so that people could afford healthy groceries, as well as a large investment in public school nutrition services. And we know that children, in order to be ready to learn, need to actually have a healthy meal in their bellies to start their day. In terms of physical activity, $6 million went towards ensuring that people could participate in physical activities throughout communities, regardless, again, of ability to pay. And then 6 million went to general health and well-being. About half of this actually supported wellness programs in middle schools and high schools, ensuring that youth have the support that they need during these particularly trying times. 3 million went towards health and nutrition knowledge, and about half of that went to hands-on experiential learning like cooking classes and school gardens, which we know sticks with people more than just traditional sort of classroom-based education. 3 million went towards preventing chronic disease, most of which supported dental screening and health screening. And lastly, 2 million went additionally towards reducing sugar-sweetened beverages through things like social media campaigns. You may all have heard of Rethink Your Drink. And it's important too to look at what types of organizations receive funding. The majority, over 60%, went directly to community organizations. So for example, this includes YMCAs, Meals on Wheels, food pantries, local nonprofits, women and minority-owned businesses. This is really important because these investments are actually building capacity of community organizations. In San Francisco, for example, they have issued 3-year community grants. So each organization that applies, and they've given out a total of 12, gets $500,000 over a period of 3 years to invest in their organization and build their capacity to serve the community. All of those organizations that receive that funding are serving priority communities, low-income communities, people of color, children. And unlike traditional grants that nonprofits write, and they're writing grants all the time, and they get it for a year, and they're so busy like checking the boxes and doing the report, they're not building out their programming. These 3-year grants were very intentionally constructed to allow organizations to increase their bandwidth to serve the community. We can see that 36 million, just under a third, went to city departments. About a third of that went to Parks and Rec, a third to public health, and the rest to either human services or to administering the tax. Schools received 15 million of the funds, and then clinics 2 million. So in summary, thinking about these tax revenue investments, what we've seen in this study is cities are investing revenues as promised. This is consistent with what proponents or the ordinances said they would do. Revenues are promoting health and developing human and community capital, and the investments are building the capacity of community organizations. So now let's focus on SSB taxes and their relationship to equity and community resilience. And I've sort of been paving the way, but when we think about investing in equity, not only do taxes address health inequities because they're expected to show the greatest improvements in communities with the greatest burden of disease, and not only are cities that are implementing taxes investing in programs that are equitable or increase economic equity, such as early childhood education and youth and professional development, but we reviewed every single allocation to see whether or not it was tagged as going towards various subgroups. And what we saw among all the money invested, 78% of investments were targeting low-income communities, 61% were targeting communities of color, and 58% were supporting children. 2 cities rapidly redirected revenues to address financial hardships during COVID. So Seattle, and you may have seen news stories on this, Seattle invested $5 million. San Francisco, an additional 1.7 million in soda tax revenues went to support access to healthy foods. As one administrator in Seattle said, the emergency voucher program has saved a lot of families during COVID. If it weren't for the sugary beverage tax in Seattle, we would not have been able to do this. And importantly, because of the previous tax revenue investments in community infrastructure, which I had referenced above, community organizations funded by tax revenues were able to expand emergency food programs, which is something we would hope to see during COVID, provide produce at affordable prices in key neighborhoods. And this was incredibly important during COVID because as you all remember, initially there was a lot of scarcity, particularly around healthier foods. And these organizations were able to distribute personal protective equipment and support clients to apply for benefits. So what happened here was by building infrastructure and increasing the infrastructure of these community organizations in advance of COVID, it increased the resilience of those community organizations and of the community overall, because they were able to support and respond quickly to this emergency. So in summary, around equity and resilience, cities are investing in programs and policies that promote equity. A majority of revenues are being invested in communities of color and low-income communities. And children, who are high consumers of sugar-sweetened beverages, are a major focus of investments. Lastly, local organizations are able to rapidly respond to shifting needs because they've already been invested in and they've gained the trust of communities and have sort of set up a pipeline or a network so that they know how to do outreach very quickly. Sugar-sweetened beverage taxes are not without challenges, certainly. Just through 2016, actually in the 8 years from 2009 to 2016, the beverage industry spent about 70 million fighting local soda taxes. So this is during the period that all but Seattle, all 6 cities except Seattle had implemented their tax. So, you know, the beverage industry wants to keep its profits and put them in the pockets of shareholders. That's what they're expected to do. They are not interested in giving them to the community or to the city. And in 2018, California enacted Preemption, banning any new local soda taxes in California through 2030. Some of you are very familiar with this. Some of you may not know about this. If you don't, I would invite you to Google my name and Preemption on the Berkeley Food Institute website. I have a report about this, a blog about this, because the way that this happened was really scary, because it essentially, it eliminates our democratic ability to vote locally on measures that our city thinks might be important. I will just say briefly that what happened was our legislators were actually pressured, kind of held hostage, and had to pass this new preemption ban. At the time, there was a lot of protests. These are our youth from Stockton who had actually been organizing to create a sugar-sweetened beverage tax because they wanted to raise revenues to support their community. And they tried really hard to get the legislators not to pass this, but again, for various reasons, it did go through. Since then, and actually this is accelerated because of the pandemic, a number of cities have put forth resolutions to the state saying that we should repeal preemption, that local jurisdictions should be allowed to create policies as they need to, and the cities shown in red are cities that have already passed these resolutions and forwarded them to the state. So I also want, because as listeners, I want you to be prepared to be able to address the questions that people may have about sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. And I say questions, but really it's what it is, it's misinformation that the beverage industry also often puts out there. And I want to make sure that you know the facts. To be fair, you know, the industry has been fighting this for a long time, and they were fighting these before we really did know how SSB taxes would shape up. We didn't know if prices would actually even change, if people would buy less, but we have the facts now because we've done a lot of rigorous research on this. So one of the first questions, or the most important questions possibly, is, are SSB taxes regressive? And by regressive, we mean, do they benefit different groups differentially, or is there a penalty to one group compared to another? And first, my issue with this question is, this is the biggest bait and switch ever, because the real question is advertising regressive? And we know that advertising is regressive. We know that the beverage industry actually targets ads to communities of color and low-income communities. This is evidence where people have studied the number of ads and where they're placed and who's investing in those. We also know that Coke and Pepsi, like many other food industry companies, they have brand managers who specifically manage their brand among Latinx consumers or Black consumers. And so when we talk about regressivity, if you have all of this marketing going towards communities of color, and we know that communities of color have been disinvested in over time, so that there's, you know, the access to healthy food is often really difficult, not to mention that healthy food is often not affordable. What we see is that SSB consumption is higher among non-white adults. So let me just orient you to this. This is a graph. These data come from the National Health and Examination Survey from the CDC, and this is covering the years from surveys done in 2003 and 4 all the way up through 2013 and 14. And this axis here is the proportion of adults consuming any sugar sweetened beverages. And this is specifically young adults who are among the highest consumers. So just sort of stepping back, we do see, yeah, there's a trend for a decline over time. We had talked about that earlier, or I spoke about that earlier in this talk. But as of 2013-14, so the most recent data in this study, what we see is that over 3/4 of Black and Latinx young adults are consuming SSBs with some regularity, compared to only about half of white young adults. So the prevalence of advertising in low-income communities and communities of color ends up showing up as differences in consumption of product, which ends up leading to diabetes being regressive as well. So who actually has diabetes? So among non-Hispanic whites, it's just about 7%, higher among Asian Americans, higher still among Hispanic and Latinx communities, high among non-Hispanic Blacks as well. And then American, Indian, and Alaskan Natives actually have almost twice the rates of diabetes of non-Hispanic whites. So when we think about, when people might say, oh, well, taxes are regressive, it is true that any flat tax, whether it's a sales tax or tax on whatever, any furniture tax, any food tax, is going to be regressive. And they're regressive because if you have more money, it actually hits your pocketbook less hard than if you have less money. So yes, based on income, flat taxes are always going to be a higher percent for those who don't make as much money. But if you look at where diabetes sits, who's likely to benefit in terms of health outcomes, who's going to get the money invested in communities, SSB taxes make tremendous sense in terms of promoting general health equity. Another question that gets asked, or things that get said, are what's the economic impact of SSB taxes? Because certainly the beverage industry has stoked a lot of fear around what taxes would do to the economy. Luckily, we have a lot of data on this as well, and we know that there are no negative economic impacts from taxes overall. So first, there's extensive evidence from tobacco taxes, no loss of jobs. And what's important here is that a healthier population not only is likely to contribute to more vibrant communities, but also to a better economy. We know that there's no effect on jobs or the economy in Mexico after 2 years of its sugar tax, and I would note that their tax was both on sugar-sweetened beverages and food products. There was no effect on employment in Philadelphia after 1 year of a beverage tax, and in a model specific to a statewide tax in California, we expect a small net job increase. And this is because the money stays in the economy. So yes, it's possible that sugar-sweetened beverage jobs would be reduced. But hopefully that means that healthy beverage jobs in industry would open up, as might public sector jobs in early childhood education, for example. We also surveyed 103 retailers in Berkeley, Oakland, and SF because I was worried about equity for sort of mom and pop stores, corner and liquor stores versus larger stores. And what we found was that when we asked, do you have any concerns about the tax? Only 24% of retailers responded yes. How has this tax affected your business? 70% said it had no effect or only a minimal effect. Do you think there should be a statewide tax? 54% responded yes. And these were consistent across store type and neighborhood income level, unlike my expectation. Last question, why does the beverage industry call it a grocery tax? Because it's scary, but in fact, we know that retailers, most of them do raise the price of sugary beverages, but only 19% raise the price of untaxed beverages. Mostly this was diet soda. And only 2 retailers among our 100 raised the price of any other product, and both it was on junk food or alcohol. So when we really mean it, we can make significant public health inroads. This is tobacco taxes. We see that from 1970 to 2020, the level of federal and state taxes per pack on average increased dramatically, and cigarette packs per person per year consumption declined dramatically. Remember, this wasn't just it wasn't just federal and state taxes, it was local taxes and smoke-free restaurants and workplaces and warning labels and advertising bans. So there's really nothing we can't do if we set our minds to it. And in terms of a path, in the face of all of these combined interventions, we saw a significant drop in lung cancer death over time. So we do have a path forward. We have the example, again, from tobacco. local flexibility is eminently possible. There's a $1 per pack federal tax. You can see that shown in the blue bars. But in these 20 jurisdictions that actually have the highest tobacco taxes, some have state taxes. State taxes range from 17 cents a pack to $4.35 a pack. Counties have enacted taxes, cities have enacted taxes, all in an effort to meet their local needs. We also know how to do participatory budgeting. So Measure D funds, this is from Berkeley, the original city with a tax. Measure D funds go into Berkeley's general fund, and a commission comprised of residents advises the city council on how to invest funds towards community-led efforts for health. So not only is Berkeley an example of how to do participatory budgeting, the California Cap and Trade program actually does just that. It figures out how to push funding out to local jurisdictions and let them decide how best to spend the money based on their priorities. So in short, I'll close just by noting that the facts are that SSB taxes really are a win-win-win. It does increase financial accountability, asking industry to pay their fair share of the burden of disease their products cause. We see significant improvements in public health, and particularly in health equity, and it builds community resilience so we can respond to disasters like COVID. So with that, I will say, please vote. And I'm excited to talk with you about any questions you might have.
Great.